Hello, ladies and gentlemen. A very good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. My name is Naweed Jabakil, and I'm honored to be the moderator for today's webinar, Clean Energy Transition Opportunities and Barriers for Renewable Energy, hosted by the Al-Attiyah Foundation in partnership with the London Stock Exchange Group Data and Analytics. Thank you for joining. We've got a fascinating discussion coming up for you in the next hour or so. Before we do delve into that, let me just go over a few housekeeping rules for the discussion. First of all, the best viewing experience. If that's what you're after, please read the instructions above the media player. If you do run into any technical issues during the webinar, please try refreshing the page first and then reach out if you're still facing difficulties to issuerservices@lseg.com. For any questions for any of the speakers, you can always click on Ask a Question. This is an interactive webinar. We'll be doing some polls throughout it as well, so please do get involved. And in the interest of time, we may be unable to address all of the questions, but we will try and get them in for you. During the session, as mentioned, there'll be polling questions as well, 3 of them to get through, so please do get involved. We're here to try and inform a debate and discussion, so your thoughts are very much part of that. And the recording of this session will be available using the same events link once it's done. Now, the topic of today, renewable energy, that's set to become a lot more prevalent this year as the push for decarbonisation. What we saw come out of the UAE consensus at COP28 a few months ago gathers pace, and as investment continues to flow into the sector, green financing. In 2023, the world added 50% more renewable energy capacity than the year before, totaling almost 510 gigawatts. That's according to the International Energy Agency, the IEA. Falling costs, they're coming down. That's been a major factor in the growth of things like solar, PV, and wind energy, and renewables now the cheapest form of power today. And they become attractive, set to gain more investment. But just how efficient are they? We'll delve into issues like that, especially compared to traditional fossil fuels. The trend does seem to be one direction, though. By 2028, global renewables capacity forecast to reach 7,300 gigawatts. That's a huge increase on the current capacity of just over 4,000. As deployments ramp up across the world, experts, they think that several trends reshaping the renewables landscape will gather pace. For instance, bifacial solar panels, they promise exciting opportunities for the industry thanks to their ability to capture sunlight on both sides rather than just one, producing more of that efficiency and usage that I just highlighted. Looking at the wind energy field, developers there continuing to move towards larger offshore turbines with gigawatt capacities to reduce per megawatt project costs. Green hydrogen, something that we hear a lot about, looking at the sector, all of those different colors, the rainbow associated with hydrogen, green, blue, white, I heard about yesterday, pink. We'll try and touch on some of the promises of hydrogen and whether or not the gas could be used to try and move the world towards a cleaner, greener future quicker. There is, though, the issue of the energy transition and looking at the energy trilemma. How do you ensure that people all across the world continue to have energy that's clean, but also energy that's in good supply, ensuring the reliability of supply, as well as the sustainability of it as well? Those will be things that we'll try and touch upon later in this session as well. But thank you once again for joining our first webinar in the 2024 series as we host an international panel of energy experts for you here to explore the latest opportunities and barriers to that energy transition. A special focus, as you've been hearing, on renewable energy. Our panelists will discuss the top anticipated trends for this year and the main concerns disincentivizing investment. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the speakers for this session. Thank you for waiting. We've got Gareth Lewis, Partner and Global Lead Development Services at ERM. Welcome, Gareth. Rory McCarthy is joining us as well. He's the Chief Operating Officer of Yellow Door Energy. And last but not least, Luma Saqqaf, the Chief Executive Officer of Ajyal Sustainability Consulting, will be bringing a bit more of a Middle Eastern view on things as we delve into this. Now, before we get started, welcome all of my panelists. Before we get started, I think it might be good to just test the waters here and see what people think. You heard me look at the promise of renewable energy there and how it's set to ramp up almost double in terms of the total output. But just a quick question, if we may, please, to get started. Let's dive into this poll before we start the discussion. You will hopefully be able to see the options coming up in this poll. The first question we have for you today is, what is the main constraint for renewable energy development around the world? Hopefully you can see that's the main constraint today for renewable energy development, which might be a good place to start the discussion. But if you can vote, please. First option there, high capital costs, long permitting and regulatory processes, supply chain bottlenecks, or high operating costs. So if you just select one of those, A, B, C, or D, we'll get the results shortly, and then we can dive in. Rory, what do you think are the main constraints today for renewable energy development?
Well, certainly across the private sector globally, one of the biggest constraints is subsidies and the amount that's globally spent on subsidizing the real cost of legacy generation, be it coal, be it gas. That is a significant barrier to move forward. If the real cost of coal is 8 cents and you subsidize it to 5 cents per kilowatt hour, you are actually slowing down the global transition across to clean energy. So that subsidies, I think, are a massive barrier. And then I think you touched on before, regulatory frameworks and the need to expand those and make them a lot more friendly, I think is very, very key. You've got, with renewable energy generation, I think you've got the ability to go on site, and you've also got the ability to transport energy across the grid. But making sure that governments are supportive of that, I think that annual conferences like COP28 go a long way towards changing that. And I think some of the messages we've disclosed this year were very positive, with the first time ever to have a commitment globally to phase down unabated coal and transition away from fossil fuels. I think those are key, and actually look to start to remove some of those subsidies.
Thank you, Rory. Luma, if I can come to you, Rory touched upon subsidies there, but from a political perspective for governments, when you have this existing industry that's so important to their economies, particularly in parts of the Middle East, for example, trying to move away from that and ignore the financials is pretty difficult.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I can talk about the MENA region specifically, and the political issues around the whole point of, or around the whole topic of energy transition, but also decarbonization, generally speaking. One of the issues, I mean, it doesn't appear a lot subsidies in the Gulf or in the MENA region, but there are a lot of other political issues that come into account. So, for example, one of the biggest issues, I guess, for a lot of countries in the MENA region is the priorities. And to what extent, although obviously all countries in the MENA region have declared NDCs and some are keenly working towards it, but there are a lot of other political priorities that might not therefore make a lot of these governments fully focused on renewable energy. Look at, for example, Egypt and Jordan. You have current political issues, but they also have huge water issues, water security issues. They have a lot of food security issues. They are poorer countries that do not have the resources to build a lot of the renewable energy that we would love to have, and so they are unable to focus in the same way as we would like on some of these projects, which is one of the biggest problems to even attracting investments as well in renewable energy, because in a lot of the cases you have to combine several issues in one. If you look, taking Egypt, for example, I don't know if you're aware of the Nuwafi platform or concept that they have used last year around COP27, where they tried to build a lot of projects around 3 areas: renewable energy, food, and also water. And so by combining the 3 priorities, they were able to attract some some investments, but that doesn't achieve all of the needed investments for the country because of that. So, the summary is countries have to play, some countries in the MENA region have to play a completely different game when it comes to attracting investment for renewable energy.
Thank you. Gareth, that's a really important point there, because we're living in a world with great geopolitical uncertainty, geoeconomic uncertainty. For policymakers in particular, when you're looking at the option of renewable and investing in that, it's may no longer be a good to have given this race to net zero, but it is a difficult consideration for many, and trying to find the funding and financing and what that detracts from elsewhere is potentially one major challenge that the renewable energy transition is facing.
No, that's for sure, and yeah, I agree with everything that's been said there. And I think particularly I work a lot in the offshore wind space globally, and we're seeing sort of that sort of differences across the world, and that geopolitical environment is very much a challenge, and sort of putting pressure certainly on the cost side and in the supply chain too. I think in terms of there's a lot of countries that have got great resource, and it's being able to tap into that resource and to get to it, and sort of getting the policies in place to do that. And we're seeing many of the governments have got they've got policies and for sort of hitting 2030 targets, but they're falling some way behind nearly across the board. And those that are doing quite well, you maybe would argue that their targets could be higher. But certainly in the offshore space, we're seeing a lot of slowing up at the early stages of the market, because they're not setting the policies, they're not setting the criteria correctly, or dithering maybe in terms of sort of getting things moving, and we're seeing a lot of delay. I think there's definitely the appetite from developers to push forward and get these projects on the ground, and to get through up until permitting phase. But there's a huge sort of backlog, if you like, of projects that are waiting to go, and sort of really needing that policy sort of starter gun to really start firing, so that everybody can move forward. And to speed up those, permitting regulatory processes, I think there's a lot of room for that to hit the ground faster.
It's interesting you say that, because thank you everyone for participating in the poll, and we've got the results of the first question that you can see up on screen. Fairly interesting, I must admit. Option D, high operating costs. 0% of people thought that was the main challenge or the main constraint for renewable energy development. So it's not the operating cost the room thinks. Option C, supply chain bottlenecks. 1 in 5 people thought that was the main constraint. And then split evenly, 40% each, is high capital costs, and then the long permitting and regulatory processes. Rory, surprised by those results? Rory, surprised by...
Apologies. I just switched my mic there on. I'm surprised to see that so many people are aware of the permitting and the regulatory issues that actually frame and delay these assets operating and getting running. It can take years, as Gareth correctly said. It can be really a prohibitive factor in assisting the energy transition. And so I think that helps. That gives me comfort that so many people are starting to be aware of it.
And just to get a sense, Gareth, if there is this issue with permitting and regulatory processes, who do you think needs to try and play a stronger role in eliminating that? I mean, national governments with their NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, very important in the decarbonisation efforts. But is there a way to try and level those regulatory processes around the world? And if so, who's responsible for doing that, do you think?
I think we saw great progress at COP28, and the tripling up of renewables in particular, and sort of setting some very clear sort of guidelines, for sort of governments to implement, and sort of what those barriers are and how they need to be tackled. So I think COP28 has been a great start to sort of really pushing through on some of that just at the end of last year. I think in terms of the one thing that's interesting, if you're going to, on the supply chain bottleneck, maybe just to link to that a little bit, and it also links to permitting, that if we're going to get all this renewable technology deployed and tripling up of those renewables, you're also going to need to triple up on things like the critical minerals, right down at the other end of the supply chain. And actually, when you look at the permitting process for critical minerals, that actually takes much longer than a renewable project. So you've got to think about, not just the immediate tier 1, tier 2, but all the way down that supply chain. I think there's more in that bottleneck to come in the future, particularly on that critical minerals.
Yeah, it's an important point. And Luma, we're seeing countries all across the world, even here in the Middle East as well, try and focus more on that critical mineral supply chain. Saudi Arabia, for example, investing very heavily in minerals to try and become part of this new super region, as they're calling it, from West Africa all the way until Central Asia. Powering that energy transition from a more fundamental basis, starting with those minerals, is going to be important. But how do we ensure that that part of the process is also kept as clean as possible?
Yes, of course. I mean, that is the decarbonizing the supply chain is one of the biggest problems that we have. But I mean, if you take it to the MENA region as a whole, not just Saudi, we are just starting to see companies focusing on that, companies focusing on their supply chains generally, and what it means to decarbonize, and what it really means to change supplies. Actually, to start by calculating carbon emissions as a basic thing is just starting to happen. So to look at how you're going to do that is an issue. But I wanted to also to talk about, I mean, one thing when we talk about supply chain bottlenecks, we are looking at probably only one side, if you like, the supply side. But there is also, what I didn't see here in the poll, is the infrastructure. So when we talk about renewable energy, we are talking about, the end use there. So the grids, and I am definitely no technician, but speaking to so many companies, these are typically some of the constraints that they talk about when we are talking about the whole value chain rather than just supply chain. So we're talking about the grid. So for example, Jordan has reached, if you like, its capacity, which is 31% renewable energy today. For a country like Jordan is a big achievement, but they're unable to move forward more because of the grid problem. They need huge investments in a new grid. Then you have, for example, in the Gulf, we are starting to see, as you know, a lot of renewables and so on, but we don't have charging stations. So the whole infrastructure piece is not being invested in as much as the core energy itself, changing the energy source. And again, that is something that will help accelerate the whole transition story once you start having all the infrastructure. But of course, it's the chicken and egg. Where do you start? And how do you progress each part of the value chain up to what point? There are all these pieces of the whole decarbonization and rolling out all of these energy transition possibilities and solutions.
And it is, we've seen the focus on the technology, like you say, whether it's the solar PV panels or the actual turbines itself, Rory. But how do you try and encourage more of that much needed investment in the wider infrastructure when it comes to setting up a world for renewable energy?
So look, I think that Luma touched on a couple of things, and she used the example of Jordan. We have about 80 megawatts, 90 megawatts of operating assets in Jordan. And as she correctly stated, the grid has sort of reached a capacity where they're unable to actually evacuate more electricity across without investing significantly into their transmission lines. But the other opportunity in countries like Jordan and countries like, across the Gulf are really, you can still do on-site generation, you can still do self-consumption, you can still ease permitting and regulation to make that flow. So for example, in Saudi Arabia, you're seeing the birth of renewables coming to bear but you've still got very, very cheap alternatives with gas generators. And Saudi Arabia is such a massive geography. It's 2.5 times the size of Texas. It's 1.2 million kilometers. You've got large industrial areas there that are completely off-grid, not connected to the network. But those particular customers in that space, cement plants, mines, steel, alloy, they're using gas generation or diesel generation. And in 2024, that's quite sad. But it's so cheap and it's so heavily subsidized. If they're able to pay 3 to 4 cents per kilowatt hour, it means you can price in renewable, but not as an additional to save you money. It's an alternative solution. And that's how we're marketing ourselves in Saudi Arabia, on an education basis, giving customers the opportunity to transition away from fossil fuels. The encouraging thing is that you've got over 1,000 companies globally, as multinationals, that have sort of basically put down clear net zero targets. And that's a 40% increase in the last 18 months, which is massive. So the amount of corporate clean energy that's starting to be purchased globally is now 46 gigawatts. That's 2.5 times what it was 3 or 4 years ago. So it's only going to increase. So I think that pressure from the private sector driving it, the birth of distributed energy, I think will also push governments as well, push policy, because the two do need to work hand in hand together. It's not so much high operating costs that are the issue, it's those subsidies that are falsifying the real cost of energy and preventing the world from moving forward as quickly as it needs to. And as Gareth correctly said, we've got to triple down, and tripling down is a massive commitment.
Gareth, Rory, touching on a few issues there, in particular looking at how to incentivize and disincentivize the use of certain types of energy. I'm here in Qatar at the moment, where we had a roundtable for the Al-Attiyah Foundation yesterday, hearing from CEOs. Irina were involved in that as well, talking about the virtues of clean energy. But one CEO from one gas production company said that it's simply fanciful to talk about a world without any fossil fuels. The real need right now and how we power our world is based largely on fossil fuels. That's been the case for several hundred years. Do you envisage a place for fossil fuels as we move forward towards these aggressive net zero targets?
I think we're obviously in a transition. We can't just stop overnight, for sure, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we're seeing, particularly in Brazil right now, a lot of focus on the sort of the greening of the actual operations of the oil and gas industry, and sort of looking at FPSOs and sort of having floating offshore turbines plugging into FPSOs to sort of green the actual operation. So that's certainly a start in the right direction. Personally, obviously, I'd love to see a world maybe that we're not using fossil fuels, but the reality is that it's certainly going to take some time to get there, and sort of need to accelerate. I think the other thing that's really of interest, and going back to Luma's point on the grid, which I think should be on this list here, I would agree with that entirely. That is a big constraint. And what we're seeing is that curtailment on the grid, and sort of you're producing energy and you're having to curtail that. So the solutions to that are going to be things like storage. Sort of, can you store? So if there's curtailment, can you store the energy? Or that's really what's sort of maybe driving that supports the green hydrogen approach as well, and sort of storing in hydrogen. And what we're seeing is a lot more of the oil and gas companies very much looking at that hydrogen sort of technology, because obviously a lot of their infrastructure works for hydrogen as well. So I do see that as a sort of where some of that transition is going to take place in that hydrogen space.
And I want to touch on that as we move along, but just to bring up the third poll question, if we can, because the pair of you, Luma and Gareth, have both touched upon grid constraints, and in fairness to the London Stock Exchange Group team, they have already factored that into one of the other questions that we'll bring up. So if we can, I'm going to flip to the third question. What do you see as the biggest hurdle on the path to clean energy? Somewhat related to the first question we had, but some macro concerns here as well. Is it technological limitations? We've spoken about how the cost of technology has come down and rapid deployment there. Geopolitical concerns, we've touched on those, something I'd like to delve into a bit more as we go along. Environmental challenges, the mining impact. Again, we spoke about how the critical minerals are being mined. And then fourth, Luma and Gareth, you'd be glad to see, and Rory as well, grid constraints. So if we can just vote, please, what do you see as the biggest hurdle on the path to clean energy? I'm going to pick up on that question. Geopolitical concerns. Luma, there's currently a war in the Middle East. We also have the war in Ukraine. We saw the impact that's had on energy markets. The United States, more than half the world's population voting this year, including the world's biggest economy, the superpower of the world militarily and economically at the moment. Geopolitical concerns, how do you assess that they're going to weigh on this transition moving forward in the next few years?
I think the Ukraine war probably was a little bit more to the point, specifically on energy at the time, because you will remember at the time how energy prices shot up almost immediately. Obviously because of Russia, because of the EU reliance and so on, and so it's a perfect, if you like, example of what is happening, and in a way ties in with the question you asked Gareth around can we live in a world without fossil fuels. I think the combination of everything that's happening is telling us a number of things. One, for the time being, there isn't a world without fossil fuel. However, it is doable, but it requires quite a bit of transition. I think I would take the UAE as a great example. If you look at their NDCs and how they are perceiving how the green or the low carbon economy is happening, you will see that they have coupled the economic growth that they want to do, doubling the economy by 2030 to 3 trillion dirhams. It is coupled with a green economy. So they know for a fact that the new growth is a green growth, and this is the UAE, that is an oil exporting country, etc. But they know that they have at some point to do that, to shift, and you can also see completely what they are doing to push behind all of that. So it's the government entities, all of them pulling in the same direction. So I guess, so to summarize, there is an impact currently that could slow the transition, but for many countries, especially in the region, they realize that it's going to happen, this transition at some point. Yes, it might be slow, but they are moving at a speed that hopefully will allow us to start seeing even more transitioning toward a low carbon economy than we would expect.
Yep, and just for international viewers who may be watching, 3 trillion dirhams, Emirati dirhams, that's about $800 billion that they want to double the size of their economy to. Rory, if a country like the United Arab Emirates, one of the largest oil producers in the world, relatively small population, at least for UAE nationals, plenty of financial firepower, it's easy for them to try and do the right thing. How do we ensure for smaller nations or some of those across Africa, for example, where it's a bit more difficult in terms of governance as well as finances, how do we ensure that they're brought along in this journey and that they understand the importance of doing this rather than it being diktat from wealthier nations above?
That's a very good point. And actually, I'm joining you this morning in Johannesburg in South Africa, where they're continuously facing load shedding challenges. And it's an example of the utility on an ongoing basis essentially failing, which is where I sort of believe that distributed energy can certainly help a country like South Africa, basically for companies and areas and even microgrids to generate behind the meter. I think is the only way forward, because the concept of a traditional utility stemmed from Thomas Edison first lighting up Wall Street in 1882, and since then they built grid networks. But our consumption of energy, our increasing consumption of energy, and on an average, if we're increasing our consumption of energy by 7 to 8% per year, which most developed countries are, we're doubling it in 10 years. So, you know, and with the birth of electric vehicles, which is also mentioned as one of the comments here, the consumption is massive. If you're in a city like Istanbul, for example, developing nation on the foothills of Europe, heavily subsidized energy right now, but is going to be massively infected by the carbon border mechanism as it struggles to keep exporting into Europe. You know, it's facing significant problems with its grid, which needs massive amount of money spent on it. Distributed energy could be a way to solve that problem, and I think that's very important. I think in Africa, it's quite different. I think in Africa, you've got the ability to do on-site generation, and where the network provides it, if you're able to connect directly into a high voltage line like an Eskom line here in South Africa, you're able to transmit energy as well. So you can do the best of both. But we're big believers in the growth of distributed energy, which is generating electricity where it is consumed, will make a big difference environmentally, and as well as secure-wise as well. If you're in a war zone like Ukraine, distributed energy, generating energy on site is going to be far more reliable than transmitting electricity 400 kilometers across a grid.
And we saw the politicization of supply chains, particularly around the war in Ukraine, but in most conflicts, actually, the access to energy, incredibly important. Gareth, I wanted to come to you before I do the results of the question we have up on screen. So option A, technological limitations, only 1 in 10 of the viewers joining us think that that's the biggest hurdle. Option C, environmental challenges, similarly 1 in 10, and almost even split between grid constraints, 1/3 of people, 33% thinking that. But clearly the biggest hurdle, as viewed by those watching now, 44% think geopolitical concerns and monopolies on many rare earth materials are the biggest factor. Gareth, as we move towards clean energy, we've just heard Rory talk about the importance of reducing the amount of space that's required for usage of this energy. That makes it a lot more efficient. But how do we ensure that supplies are not politicized in the future? Maybe a very difficult question. If you look at the United States now, the IRA, trillions of dollars, up to $4 trillion. One US diplomat told me yesterday, in fact, that they were planning on the economic impact. But many people see that as not good for the environment, good for renewable energy, but actually protectionist in what the United States is doing. How do we ensure that the politics is kept out as much as possible?
I think it is a very difficult question.
Yeah.
From that perspective, I think, you know, one of the things that we're actively looking at right now is, you know, particularly the flow from China into the West, and sort of the critical minerals side of it, but also the manufacture and the different levels. But you know, there's a to and fro, but it's trying to balance that out. But most importantly, like as Rory has said as well, there is that localization side, and sort of the local communities where a lot of this material is coming from, and sort of what's the benefit to them, and sort of you know, we're seeing that more and more in different areas, Colombia, Brazil, and sort of Philippines, in terms of where these projects are, what is the benefit to those local communities for the projects, and sort of ensure. And I think it comes into that environmental element as well, in terms of, you know, maximizing the potential for a nature positive energy transition. So, you know, sort of sustainable development and an orderly energy transition that leaves no one behind. And that, you know, that's one of the stated goals from the COP letter that GREC put on the tripling up of renewables. So we need to make sure that all communities all the way along the line, that there is benefit, and it's not, like you say, just the rich nations sort of benefiting and exploiting from that perspective. So we're seeing more and more of that sort of sustainability coming into the environmental aspects, and when projects are given permission, and looking at that whole looking at the whole supply chain, not what's just immediately in front of a regulator to determine. And another example is on the Celtic Sea, for example, now, and we're seeing this in other areas as well. Sort of, it's not just about price. When you're doing an auction, it's not just about price. It's what are the other non-price criteria, and we're seeing that more and more coming into place. The Celtic Sea Crown Estates confirmed there'll be a contractual obligation on the preferred bidders to produce and adhere to a plan that details steps that will enhance the marine ecosystem. So, in terms of environmental benefits, so they actually have to positively enhance their environment, not just place the technology and move on.
And Luma, it seems that the world we're living in at the moment, this fracturing multipolarity, if you like, of who's making the decisions. One shadow that's weighing over many countries, including here in the Middle East, is the rivalry between the US and China. If you look at renewable energy, China by far the biggest producer of things like solar PVs. So for countries that are choosing to decide to do business with China, there's a risk there when it comes to the other side. Do you worry? Are you concerned that renewable energy and the infrastructure and technology around it will be the next issue to be falling under the weight of the US-China rivalry, like we've seen with rare earths and semiconductors in recent years?
Perhaps the US and China, because of their size, they exacerbate any smaller problem. But if you step out, I think I see the rivalry, not just US China. We have EU issues as well. They have their own, they are setting up their own regulations as well in terms of supply chains, and we have the border adjustment mechanism. And so there are so many things happening across the board that impacts directly any, not just renewable, any sustainability issue, to be honest, on a much bigger scale. And so one of the concerns I have is, to what extent are we now starting to have what we used to call in the law days forum shopping, meaning you choose where do you move your business from a regulatory perspective, what's best for you. And so are we therefore starting to see that the EU okay, let's see what's going to happen with the US, the new SEC rule. But the EU generally, are they now living in a bubble so that everyone else is going to slowly start trading less with the EU, for example, and we start seeing more and more trading across the South? We are already seeing significant amount of investments coming out, for example, of the GCC into Africa and into the MENA region as a whole. We're still seeing some investments, for example, from Masdar and from some of the GCC countries into EU. But are we seeing the same numbers as we're seeing in terms of sustainability and renewable energy projects? The UAE alone committed $4.9 billion to invest in Africa in green projects. That is a significant number just coming out of one country. So are we, as a result of all of these regulatory issues, but also, as we say, trade issues as well, are we going to see, the South speaking to the South only? That to me is a big concern.
Yeah, and the global South, or the so-called global South, the developing world, really important to powering this because of the issues like you touched upon, Rory, in terms of electricity generation and not having the industrialized output that many Western nations or G7 and OECD, the majority of those nations have. But there is one important factor here. I mean, aside from electricity generation, the industry use and transport use, Gareth, I mean, surely we need to be looking at that in terms of how we transition those two sectors in particular if we're going to be seriously talking about net zero. And I'll come to you in a second, Rory. Gareth?
Yeah, no, certainly, and obviously we're seeing the rise in electric vehicles. I think sort of the use of green hydrogen in particular is more for maybe the bigger transport, such as agriculture and shipping. We're seeing more sort of movement in that direction, and sort of so if renewable energy can be used to generate sort of this green electricity and green hydrogen, then sort of that does help with powering. But we're going to need significant investment in the infrastructure for electric vehicles in particular. So the vehicles are there, but I don't think I drive one myself, but the infrastructure really isn't there in many countries, and sort of so it is hard and sort of complicated. Whereas you can just turn up at a gas station and fill your car up with petrol. and away you go. So I think that there's still quite a way to go, but we are getting there. And obviously we're seeing more and more governments putting the policies in place to do that. And then that will in turn drive some of the desire, if you like, to do more renewable energy projects to produce this green energy.
Yeah, Rory, just to come to you on that point, yellow door energy. I mean, as looking at the renewable energy world at the moment, there is a major focus, as Luma touched upon earlier, on individuals, on the technology, on consumers and personal behavior. But in reality, the world we live in, airlines require liquid fuel. If you look at shipping, etc., is there enough being done, do you think, perhaps not as visibly as we'd like, but is there enough being done to try and transition those sorts of sectors, which at the moment are crucial to life on Earth as we know it, but also need to be cleaner and greener in the future?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. I mean, there's a few things there. So I'll touch on first that biofuel is being experimented on quite heavily. Sustainable aviation fuel for airplanes is definitely something we're going to see more of moving forward. But at the moment, you're looking potentially by 2030, only 5% of commercial aircraft will be running sustainable aviation fuel, right? Which is, but it's a big start, but it is a big step forward. But there is billions of dollars going into changing that industry because it's a massive, massive polluter. And every time we jump on a plane, we're increasing our carbon footprint terribly. If I touch on the EV piece in terms of personal choices, you're absolutely right. I think that if you look at the air quality now in Beijing compared to what it was, sort of 3-4 years ago, it's markedly different. And they've had a massive, massive push on renewable across China. Obviously, they have the strength in terms of the fact they manufacture, good 80% of the world's, solar panels. They've had gigawatts and gigapods of clean energy being rolled out. And they're obviously the world's leading manufacturer now of electric vehicles. And their EV push is significant. And it's evident as to what's actually happening by the fact that they're cleaning up their cities and they're doing it quite quickly. So EVs is a massive push. Infrastructure, Gareth touched on. I think this is a real struggle point. What we do is when we put into commercial customers, we'll often put in solar, we'll put in batteries, we'll put in EV charging stations to complement for their staff or for their customers. But if you're running in a big city, let's pick any big city, it could be Istanbul, as I mentioned Istanbul before, for example, you've got a city of 20 million people. And by the time you get to 2028, companies like Volkswagen will have closed down most of their factories for, diesel cars, petrol producing cars, and the bulk of what they will produce is going to be electric only. It's going to happen. A tipping point is 3 to 4 years away. Solid state batteries, again, 3 to 4 years away, which means you'll be able to charge an electric vehicle in 2 or 3 minutes, not 25 or 30 minutes. These are massive changes. But if you have 10 million electric vehicles in a massive city like Istanbul, and everyone plugs into the grid on a Friday night, it's not the same as switching on Netflix when you're drawing 200 watts. You're plugging in, drawing 7,200 watts. You're going to cause a massive voltage fluctuation on your transmission line. Again, another reason why we're big believers at Yellow Door Energy, why distributed energy is probably the way forward. Localized energy, localized management, localized generation. Oh, one more thing, hydrogen. You did touch on hydrogen. I love the idea of hydrogen. What I don't love about hydrogen is the fact that it takes 18 kilograms of water to produce 1 kilogram of hydrogen gas, or 10 to 11 cubic meters of water, which is quite a lot, 10,000, 11,000 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of hydrogen. Doesn't sound particularly renewable to me personally. And then, of course, you've got the safety factors, the fact it's so flammable, holding, storage, shipping major issues, and again, major cost, as well as the efficiency losses when you move hydrogen around. That's why I'm not the believer in hydrogen as a magic bullet, although I do see the value of it, particularly in certain industries.
And that's a natural place to take this conversation, actually looking at the future energy mix when we move on. But again, funnily enough, I had a conversation with someone here in Doha about hydrogen and looking at how it could be produced with by the decomposition of water instead. But that's still a very, very expensive, nearly 5 times more expensive. So there is investment going into that. That's something that ADNOC, I know, are doing, as well as Qatar Energy, looking at hydrogen as a potential fuel source for the future. Natural gas also plays a critical role, and that takes us on to the next question, the final question we have in this poll. If we could please just go back to number 2, which sector should be a priority for energy transition investments? You've got several options there. Renewables, nuclear, a very important one, relatively very clean, which as far as the transition is concerned, an important one potentially, but costly to set up. Energy storage, electrified transport, heat, hydrogen, sustainable materials, carbon capture and storage, again, been around for decades, but its use still growing rapidly in the last few years, but still relatively minimal, and all of the above. So if you can vote, please, we'll get to that. Luma, which sector should be a priority for investments at the moment?
Okay. Probably that is part of the problem, is that there are so many sectors that we need to invest in. There are so many sectors that are important, that have potential, but also we have country priorities. As you're saying, I mean, hydrogen, of course, everybody's talking about it, but the Middle East, for example, water shortage is our biggest problem. To what extent, how are we going to move the technology in a way that makes sense? So yes, nuclear energy, the UAE has already invested in that. Renewable energy, obviously, across the board. The UAE is already also, and Saudi, investing a lot in carbon capture technologies. And there is so much there that can happen, but there's a lot of money that is needed for all of that. And again, we go back to what are going to be the country priorities, because you can't have all of those in all of the countries. It has got to be bits and pieces in some countries. And maybe that also brings up a very big topic, which is collaboration and cooperation more and more between countries. And how do we use that, but by definition, climate is a global problem and is everyone's problem, literally. And so is there a better way to cooperate? And I asked that question, obviously, specifically in the MENA region. Is there a much better way to cooperate, to collaborate, to work on sharing some of the targets, some of the finances that are needed to develop some of these? This is something that I certainly hope we will see more and more of in our region.
And it's encouraging, perhaps, Gareth, that we've been speaking about the role of the public sector and governments. We know that in some parts of the world, they can be slow to move. Resources are relatively finite, especially when they have other considerations, as we've touched upon. It must be encouraging to see the private sector take more of a role in financing this. We've seen green financing rise exponentially in recent years. More than 100-fold increase, according to the City UK, over the past decade. The likes of BlackRock, Larry Fink, making it a personal issue for himself, and many other banks now setting up and focusing on green financing divisions. That must be encouraging, because at least there is money flowing into the sector.
Absolutely, and we're seeing it more and more, the sort of pension funds and sort of private investment sort of driving the need for change. And so we get involved in a lot of transactions and due diligence and sort of buying and selling of projects, and we're seeing more and more of the sort of financial sector sort of moving in and sort of making those and much earlier investments in the development stage as well, not just projects that are completed and sort of operational, but sort of that investment's coming much earlier, as well, as people want to secure their offtake or their green credits sort of much earlier in the pipeline. And I think I don't know if the results are in yet, but I don't know if they are. But I've got my own sort of thoughts here. I mean, certainly sort of all of the above in sort of different levels. But I think the ones that I'm obviously more involved with, renewable energy and maybe the energy storage side, and I think the hydrogen, and just to go back to some of the technology and picking up on sort of Rory's concerns maybe on the hydrogen, is we're developing we're involved in a development called the Dolphin project, which is a floating offshore turbine in seawater that we firstly do produce the fresh water from the sea, using a small amount of energy, and then we go through the electrolysis process on each of those turbines, and it's sort of something that we believe works. You've got that desalination element to it as well, as part of the process, and then fitting in. And I think that there's that good segue into that oil and gas, and sort of being part of that transition as well. I think does work, but certainly, that there's a place for all of these, right now, and where we are in the world today.
I'll just run through the results that we've got in for this poll. Only 4 answers received any weight whatsoever. The first one, option A, renewable energy, just under 1 in 5 people thought that, 17%. Similarly, option H, that's carbon capture and storage, the same figure, as well as energy storage, option C, but more than half of people choosing all of the above. So clearly all of them seem fairly important. Rory, just to come on that issue of investment, when you consult firms in the region across the world, when they're looking to make these investments in renewable energy, are they doing it because it makes business sense? Are they doing it because they care? Or what's the key driver for the majority of investments that you see at the moment?
It depends. It does depend. It is a bit of both. But if I look at, say, Saudi Arabia, they're doing it, one, because they want to transition. They're not necessarily going to save money because the subsidies on energy are just so high, right? But if you do it, and if you're in South Africa and you're a mine, you're doing it out of necessity, because the cost of that mine failing. If your electricity falls, you need to make sure that you've got security of supply. That's your number one concern. Then, of course, you need to be as competitive as possible. So it comes down to also cost. If you're heavy energy intensive users, energy can represent 65 to 70% of the overhead, which is massive. If you're in a sector like fast moving consumable goods or retail, then it's less, then it's 10 or 15%. But those heavy energy users, they are significantly affected by energy. So security of supply and security of supply is really important in a lot of countries, less so in our developed nations, but certainly not in the GCC, where you've got a very, very strong series of networks there. But certainly in Africa, security of supply is massive. Certainly parts of Asia is very important as well. And any war-torn country, distributed energy would solve Iraq's problems right now. And there's a lot being done towards that in its development. So I think everything on this list is relevant. And I do actually think that also, I'm a big believer in renewable energy and echo what Gareth said. But I do think nuclear has a place. I do think hydrogen has a place. I do think carbon capture and storage has a place, certainly in the oil gas sector. So I'm very supportive of everything mentioned.
Great, thank you. And I think most people would probably agree with that the energy mix of the future, while the goal towards renewable energy and clean production is a noble one, in actual fact, there is space for other energy sources, particularly if you look at the developing world and countries there with their power systems and need for electricity. If you look at Africa, doubling, tripling by some estimates over the next few decades. But I will come back to each of the speakers. I just want to go into some questions that we've got from the participants watching. How do you see hydrogen in the future is a question we've had. Higher interest rates. I'll read out the question and then we'll take it. Higher interest rates have already adversely affected the renewable investment trusts. How will high interest rates continue to impact the clean energy transition? Gareth, I'll start that one off with you.
Yes, maybe not my specialist field, but obviously that is going to have an impact and on the finances. I think the sort of overall costs of projects and the sort of capital costs, we have seen changes, particularly with the geopolitical situation, and sort of that's been driving prices up across the board. I think there are some other, maybe just to divert a little bit, is particularly with offshore wind turbines, we've been seeing them getting bigger and bigger and bigger, which has been great in terms of sort of not needing to deploy so many units on the ground, getting better margins. But what we're seeing in the supply chain is that they can't keep up. So that everything's getting too big too quickly almost, and sort of you need a period of rationalization where maybe you can stick for a period of, I don't know, five years or so. But developers are constantly trying to increase the size of their turbines. That changes the environmental position, but the supply chain isn't necessarily keeping up, and that is also driving costs up because they're having to redo their production lines and things like that. So there's a bit of a balance to be had in everything that's in relation to capex and costs.
Thanks, Gareth. Luma, I'm just going to come to you because we do have a few other questions coming in. How can small businesses participate in the energy transition? The United Arab Emirates, for example, many see it as a major oil producer, but 90% of the economy is driven by SMEs, a similar figure in Saudi Arabia. How can small businesses participate in the energy transition?
Look, the fact that SMEs constitute more than 90% is a fact in most countries that I know of, where you have significant proportions of SMEs. That's what runs countries generally. Now, one of the interesting things about the MENA region is that we have a significant difference today if you look at what is happening on a government and government-related entities level, and then the rest, if you like, of the market. So when you look at the government, NDCs, how they're pushing through, but also all the government-related entities, you have the Masdar, you have Taqa, this is the UAE, obviously, but similarly in Saudi, PIF, Aramco, they're all the big companies are driving, but we're not, but it seems to stop there, if you like. The next level, we haven't reached there yet, and we haven't engaged fully, if you like, with the private sector, with the smaller businesses to become part of the process. That is something that the governments need to look at, exactly because of the reasons we were discussing, that 90% of any country typically is SMEs. Now we know that, for example, in the UAE, the banks and financial institutions have committed again $1 trillion dirhams by 2030, so in 7 years' time, for sustainable finance. So there is money available to help a lot of companies wishing to enter into this lucrative, if you like, or the direction of where the country is going from a UAE perspective. But in order for you to benefit from that, you need to have your ducks in a row. You need to have already started with your plan. How are you going to use that money? How to start having plans, to start having your own disclosure and green plans as to how you're going to use all of this. This we're not seeing yet. That level is still something that we haven't seen yet, and part of it is the government, that because in reality, you asked the question, what's driving green energy? It's either regulations or seeing a profit. Seeing a profit, I'd leave it to Rory and Gareth to talk about that, but the other side of it is the government and having to incorporate more and more requirements on companies to be able to participate.
And that's something that will encourage more use of it. Thank you. Very important point, actually, about the role of regulation. And it goes back to the first question that we had. A final question then, Rory, I'll let you take this one. It says, while the world has added 50% more renewable energy capacity last year over the previous year, are renewables actually replacing fossil fuels, or are we just adding new capacity? A good question to finish off on.
Yeah, look, I think that's a great question. And I think that you've got $1.8 trillion worth of investment in renewable energy in 2023. And I think as a closing statement from me, that is the first time ever that investment in renewable energy has actually been at the same level as oil and gas. So yes, I do actually see it actually starting to replace, when you're seeing the same investment value for the first time ever in renewable that you're seeing in oil and gas, which is massive. I mean, our business, as Luma was chatting about before, our business is based across 6 countries. We focus on the mid-sized customers. We focus on industrial customers, commercial customers. And that's evident to the fact that those customers are switching to clean energy, because you've got 130 sites that we have alone with 90 customers across 6 countries that are now producing 50% of their own energy through clean sources. That has a massive difference. So I think it's a big point, but I think it's a massive statement that that amount of money is being invested in energy transition in technologies. It's a 17% increase on the previous year in 2022. It's big.
That certainly is. Yeah, just to put that into perspective, the total GDP of Saudi Arabia, about $1.2, $1.3 trillion, so $1.8 trillion of investment, certainly encouraging for those who are in the space at least. But thank you very, very much to all 3 of my panelists for this very interesting discussion. We were tasked with looking at the opportunities and challenges of the clean energy and the renewable energy transition, which we've delved into lots of different areas, looking at the macro, geopolitical and economic concerns, some of the financing issues around investment as well, and then also the importance of regulatory processes and even industry and transport, as well as individuals playing their role as well. On the whole, I would say that there's optimism, plenty of it among the speakers here. But thank you very much for joining us. That's Gareth Lewis, partner and global lead development services at ERM, Rory McCarthy, the chief operating officer of Yellow Door Energy, and Luma Saqqaf, the chief executive officer of Ajyal Sustainability Consulting. Thank you, all 3 of you, for giving up the time and adding to this debate. And thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar series supported by the Al-Attiyah Foundation in partnership with London Stock Exchange Group Data and Analytics. We look forward to welcoming you to future webinars. And a reminder, you can watch this after this is done and share it as well, which we'll encourage you to do. And may I please encourage all of you to fill out the post-event survey, which will be shown on the screen. You could hopefully see that's a QR code, and you can fill it out on the same event page as well. I'm Naweed Jabarkil. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Goodbye.